Victoria Vance did not believe in second chances or rusty metal. As the chief executive of Vance Realty, she lived her life in the sharp lines of glass skyscrapers and the cold precision of high-stakes contracts. On a Tuesday afternoon, while the rain hammered against the roof of her black limousine, she watched through the tinted window as Caleb Sterling struggled with a tow rope in his driveway. He was a man who looked like he had been built from the same weathered wood as his small house. Caleb was hauling a twisted block of iron that barely resembled a vehicle into his garage. It had no wheels and the body was covered in a layer of red oxidation so thick it looked like it had been pulled from the bottom of a lake. Victoria tapped the glass to signal her driver to stop. She lowered the window just enough to let the scent of wet asphalt and grease into the climate-controlled interior. "Caleb," she called out, her voice cutting through the sound of the downpour like a blade. "I am closing a $30 million deal on the lot next door tomorrow morning." Caleb paused, his grease-stained hands tightening on the rope as he wiped rain from his forehead with a frayed sleeve. He did not look at her directly. Victoria continued with a smile that never reached her eyes. "That $100 pile of scrap is a scar on the property values of this entire neighborhood. It belongs in a landfill, not sitting next to my development." Caleb turned his head slightly, his gaze fixed on the rusted frame. "It looks like $100 to you, Victoria," he said quietly. His voice was steady and devoid of the agitation she expected. "But some people only see the rust while others hear the heart of a machine." Victoria laughed, and the sound was as sterile as her office. "I see a man wasting his daughter's future on garbage," she replied before nodding to her driver. The limousine slid away, leaving Caleb standing in the mud. Inside the garage, 6-year-old Lily Sterling sat on an overturned plastic bucket. She clutched an old woolen scarf that had belonged to her mother, holding it against her cheek as she watched her father enter. The air in the garage smelled of oil and old memories. "Daddy," Lily whispered, her eyes large and observant. "Why is that lady so mean to us?" Caleb crouched down so he was level with her. He reached out and gently tucked a stray curl behind her ear, leaving a faint smudge of graphite on her skin. "She is not mean, Lily. She is just focused on things that can be measured in a bank account. She does not know yet that the most important things in this world are often hidden under layers of time." Caleb stood up and walked over to the chassis. He ran his fingers along the side of the metal where the rust had begun to flake away. To the rest of the world, it was a $100 mistake. To Caleb, it was a ghost calling out for someone to remember its name. He picked up a wire brush and began the slow, methodical work of revealing the truth. "Before we go on, have you ever seen something valuable that everyone else called trash? And tell me where you're watching from." The next morning, Caleb woke at 4:30 to the sound of wind rattling the loose tin on the garage roof. He dressed in the dim light of a single 40-watt bulb, careful not to wake Lily, who was still curled under her blankets in the adjacent room. He walked into the garage and stood before the rusted frame. The air was cold and carried the sharp scent of damp earth and old oxidation. Victoria Vance had called it garbage, but Caleb saw the geometry of the suspension and the deliberate taper of the rear axle. These were not the markings of a mass-produced vehicle. He spent 3 hours with a degreaser and a brass wire brush working on the lower section of the block. He moved with a slow economy of motion developed over 20 years of handling delicate machinery. By 7 o'clock, he had cleared a patch of the engine casing. Beneath the grime, a stamp appeared in the metal. It was a small stylized crest consisting of 2 crossed hammers over a lightning bolt. Caleb felt a dull thrum of recognition in his chest. He pulled an old ledger from the shelf, its pages yellowed and smelling of cedar. He scanned the entries until he found a matching sketch from an auction catalog dated 1974. It was the mark of Silas Thorne, a custom builder who had vanished from the racing scene after a laboratory fire in Nevada. Thorne had been rumored to be working on a prototype that could redefine aerodynamic drag. Caleb ran his hand over the cold metal. The surface was rough, but the lines were unbroken. He heard a soft step behind him. Lily was standing in the doorway wearing her oversized fleece jacket and holding the woolen scarf. Her eyes moved from the engine to her father's face. "Is it still sick, Daddy?" she asked. Caleb smiled and reached out to tap the metal frame. "It is just sleeping, Lily," he said. "We are just waking it up." He knew the neighborhood association would be arriving soon. Victoria Vance did not make idle threats. She was a woman who used city ordinances as personal scalpels to remove anything she found unappealing. At exactly 9 o'clock, a white sedan marked with city compliance stickers pulled to the curb. Victoria was already standing there, her heels sinking slightly into the soft grass of the verge. She was talking to a man in a short-sleeved uniform who held a clipboard. She pointed toward Caleb's garage with a gloved finger. Caleb walked out, wiping his hands on a rag. He did not rush. He stood at the edge of his driveway and waited. "Mr. Sterling," the official said, looking at his clipboard. "We have a complaint regarding a hazardous derelict vehicle on private property." Victoria adjusted her sunglasses. "It is a public nuisance, Caleb," she added, her voice smooth and practiced for an audience. "The smell of those chemicals and the sight of that wreck are depressing the market interest for the luxury condos next door." Caleb looked at the official, then at Victoria. "The vehicle is secured on a level surface and is not leaking fluids," he said. His voice was flat. "I am within the limits of the hobbyist restoration code." Victoria stepped forward. "A hobby is a classic Mustang, Caleb. This is a $100 anchor dragging down the value of my $60 million investment." She looked at Lily, who was now standing behind Caleb's leg. "Do you really want your daughter growing up in a junkyard?" Caleb did not flinch. He looked at the official, who seemed uncomfortable. "I need 48 hours to finish the identification," Caleb said. Victoria laughed. "You have until Friday morning, Caleb, or the city tow truck will be here to crush it." The sedan drove away, and Caleb turned back to the garage. He had 2 days to prove a ghost was real. The garage felt smaller as the 48-hour deadline began its silent countdown. Caleb did not waste time watching Victoria's sedan disappear around the corner. He returned to the workbench and picked up a specialized magnifying loupe and a precision pick tool. His focus shifted entirely to the area behind the fuel pump housing, where the metal was thickest and most protected. Lily dragged her plastic bucket closer and sat in silence while the rhythmic scrape of steel against iron filled the small space. She watched her father's hands and noted how they never trembled even when the cold air made his breath visible. Caleb was looking for a secondary verification mark that Silas Thorne was known to hide within the casting of his experimental blocks. He cleared a layer of heavy grease that had preserved the metal for decades like a dark amber. A series of 6 digits emerged from the shadows of the engine bay. Caleb compared these numbers to the handwritten ledger he had kept since his days as a lead restoration specialist for the National Racing Circuit. The sequence matched a missing requisition order from the spring of 1972. This was not just a prototype, but the legendary Storm Chaser chassis that was rumored to have achieved speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour during secret desert testing. Caleb felt the weight of the discovery settle in his shoulders. He was holding a piece of history that the world believed had been reduced to ash 50 years ago. The value of the raw materials was negligible, but the provenance made it priceless. Lily reached out and touched a clean patch of the metal with one finger. "It is cold, Daddy," she said. Caleb placed his hand over hers and felt the contrast of her warmth against the ancient steel. "It has been in the dark for a long time, Lily," he replied. He knew Victoria Vance would not wait until Friday morning to apply pressure. She operated on the principle that people like Caleb were obstacles to be cleared rather than neighbors to be respected. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, a flatbed tow truck slowed to a crawl in front of the house. The driver leaned out the window and stared at the garage for a full minute before taking a photograph with his phone. Caleb watched from the shadows of the workbench but did not step outside. He needed every second to document the engine timing and the unique valve configuration. If the city returned before he could prove the identity of the car, the storm chaser would be crushed and sold for scrap weight. He picked up his camera and began taking high-resolution images of the hammers and lightning bolt crest. He then logged into a secure forum used by the most elite automotive historians in the country. He uploaded 3 photos and a single sentence asking for a verification of the Thorn registry. The reply came 9 minutes later from an encrypted account in Switzerland. It was a request for the chassis dimensions and a scan of the internal crankshaft seal. Caleb grabbed his calipers and went back to work while the tow truck circled the block for the 3rd time. The compression was tightening and the neighborhood was watching. Victoria Vance wanted a clean lot, but Caleb Sterling was about to show her that some ghosts have a roar that can shake the foundations of an empire. He heard the truck stop again, and this time the air brakes hissed right at the edge of his driveway. Caleb stood up and wiped the grease from his palms. The time for hiding was over. Caleb did not open the door immediately when the air brakes hissed at the edge of his driveway. He watched through the small oil-stained window of the garage as the driver of the flatbed truck stepped out and adjusted a heavy steel chain. The man was thick around the middle with a name tag that read Miller pinned to a fluorescent vest. Caleb felt a small hand tugging at his pocket and looked down to see Lily holding her mother's woolen scarf tight against her chest. "Are they taking the sleeping car, Daddy?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the idling diesel engine outside. Caleb knelt and placed his hands on her shoulders. "Not today, Lily," he said. He stood up and walked out into the bright afternoon sun. Victoria Vance was not in her limousine this time, but she was present in the form of a black SUV parked across the street. The driver's side window was down 3 inches, allowing her cold, calculating gaze to anchor Caleb to the spot. Caleb ignored her and walked directly to the tow truck driver. "You are early, Miller," Caleb said as he crossed his arms. The driver looked at his clipboard, then at the rusted chassis sitting inside the open garage. "Orders from the city compliance office said immediate removal of hazardous waste," Miller replied. He looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. "It is not waste, and it is not hazardous," Caleb said firmly. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was the hobbyist restoration permit he had renewed just 2 months ago. Miller took the paper and frowned while he read the fine print. Victoria's SUV door opened, and she stepped out onto the asphalt. Her heels made a sharp, rhythmic clicking sound that seemed to pace the tension in the air. "The permit is for a vehicle, Caleb," Victoria said as she approached. "That is a pile of oxidized iron. You are harboring a breeding ground for rodents and lowering the safety rating of my construction site." Caleb turned to her. He did not look at her expensive blazer or the gold watch on her wrist. He looked at her eyes. "This car has more integrity in one rusted bolt than your entire board of directors, Victoria," Caleb said. His voice was quiet, but it carried to the neighbors who were now watching from their porches. Victoria's face tightened, and she turned back to the driver. "Do your job, Miller, or I will call your supervisor." Miller looked at Caleb, then at the permit, and finally at the powerful woman standing in front of him. He sighed and reached for the winch controls. Caleb didn't move. He stood between the truck and the garage. At that moment, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a notification from the Secure History Forum. The message was brief and written in all capital letters. It said, "Stop everything. Do not let anyone touch the chassis. Arthur Montgomery is in flight." Caleb looked up at the sky. He didn't hear a helicopter yet, but he felt a shift in the wind. He turned his phone screen toward Victoria. "You might want to wait another 5 minutes," Caleb said. Victoria didn't even look at the screen. "Winch it up, Miller," she commanded. The steel cable began to unspool with a high-pitched metallic whine. Caleb looked back at the Storm Chaser chassis. He knew that once those chains gripped the frame, the internal seals would break, and the 50-year-old history would be lost forever. He took a step forward, his boots grinding into the gravel. "Before the first chain touches that metal, you should know exactly who is coming to this driveway," Caleb said. Victoria stopped and narrowed her eyes. The air brakes hissed again, and a second black car, this one with government plates, pulled up behind the tow truck. The compression was over, and the explosion was about to begin. Caleb felt a strange sense of calm as a man in a tailored gray suit stepped out of the new arrival, holding a leather briefcase. The neighborhood went silent. Caleb turned back to his garage and whispered to himself that the ghost was finally awake. Victoria stood frozen as the man in the gray suit walked past her without a word and headed straight for Caleb Sterling. Caleb saw the crossed hammers logo on the man's lapel pin. The world believed the Storm Chaser was ash, but Caleb was about to prove that some legends simply refused to burn. He looked at Victoria one last time and saw the first crack in her perfect composure. The Friday morning deadline didn't matter anymore, because the king had sent his messenger. Caleb reached out and touched the cold iron of the chassis, knowing that the next 60 seconds would change the history of the entire city. Victoria Vance was about to learn that you cannot buy the soul of a machine with a $30 million check. Caleb stood his ground. The man in the suit opened his briefcase. The tow truck winch stopped mid-rotation. Caleb heard Lily's small voice behind him, saying that she could hear the car's heart beating now. He knew she was right. The silence of the street was about to be broken by a roar that had been waiting 50 years to be heard. Caleb Sterling looked at the tow truck driver and simply shook his head. The time for trash was over, and the time for treasure had arrived. Caleb felt the weight of the moment in his chest. Everything was about to change. The man in the gray suit did not look at the tow truck or the heavy chains dangling inches from the garage floor. He stepped onto the oil-stained concrete of Caleb's driveway with a pace that suggested the world waited for him rather than the other way around. He held a leather briefcase with a brass lock that caught the afternoon sun. Victoria Vance straightened her blazer and took a step toward him, her professional smile snapping into place like a mask. "I assume you are with the city attorney's office," she said, her voice reclaiming its usual authority. "You are just in time to witness the removal of this safety hazard." The man stopped and looked at Victoria for 3 seconds. It was a cold, clinical observation that made her smile falter. "My name is Julian Thorne," the man said. His voice was low and carried a resonance that seemed to vibrate in the quiet street. "I am the chief legal counsel for the Montgomery Heritage Trust." Victoria's eyes widened as the name registered. Everyone in American real estate knew the trust was the primary vehicle for Arthur Montgomery's global holdings. Julian turned his back on Victoria and looked at Caleb Sterling. He noticed the grease on Caleb's forehead and the steady way the father held his daughter's hand. "Mr. Sterling," Julian said with a slight nod. "We received your transmission on the historian circuit." Caleb did not move his gaze from the lawyer's face. "The chassis dimensions and the internal crankshaft seal are verified," Caleb replied. "It is the 1972 Storm Chaser." Julian opened his briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of heavy parchment paper. He turned to Miller, the tow truck driver, who was still standing by his winch controls. "If a single link of those chains touches that metal frame, your company will be liable for the destruction of a unique cultural artifact insured for $6 million, Julian said. Miller looked at the paper, then at Victoria, then quickly retreated to his truck cabin. Victoria marched forward, her heels striking the pavement like a gavel. "This is a neighborhood zoning issue," she snapped. "I don't care who insures it. That piece of junk is violating the aesthetic standards of my development project." Julian Thorne did not raise his voice. He handed the parchment to Victoria. "It is not a piece of junk, Victoria," Julian said. "It is the first hand-built engine block designed by Silas Thorne before his disappearance." Victoria scanned the document, her face turning a pale shade of gray as she reached the bottom. At the garage door, Lily tightened her grip on her mother's woolen scarf and looked up at her father. "Daddy, the car is famous now," she whispered. Caleb knelt down and kissed her forehead, his eyes finally softening. "The car was always famous, Lily," he said. "The world just needed someone to remind them." Victoria looked from the document to the rusted metal frame sitting in the shadows. The high-pitched whine of a helicopter began to grow in the distance, rattling the windows of the condos she was so proud of. Arthur Montgomery was no longer just a name on a forum. He was coming to claim what everyone else had walked past. Caleb stood up and watched the tow truck pull away, leaving the driveway empty for the legend that was about to arrive. The neighborhood fell into an expectant silence as the shadow of the helicopter crossed the street. Caleb Sterling looked at the machine he had rescued for $100 and knew that the heart he had heard beating was finally about to roar. The shadow of the heavy aircraft swept over the gravel driveway as the roar of the engines drowned out the distant city traffic. Caleb felt the vibration in the soles of his boots while the air became a swirling vortex of dust and dry leaves. Victoria Vance retreated several steps toward her black SUV and shielded her eyes with a manicured hand. The helicopter settled onto the vacant lot next door, and the rotors began their slow, clicking descent into silence. Caleb did not move his feet, but his hand tightened around Lily's small fingers. A side door on the machine slid open with a smooth hydraulic hiss. Arthur Montgomery stepped onto the grass wearing a dark racing jacket that bore the faded logos of a dozen championship seasons. He was a man with white hair and eyes that looked like they had spent a lifetime staring into the sun at 200 miles per hour. He did not look at Victoria Vance or the black SUV. His gaze was locked on the open garage door where the rusted chassis of the Storm Chaser sat in the shadows. Arthur walked toward Caleb with a limp that told the story of a high-speed crash in 1982. He stopped 3 feet from the driveway and took a long breath of the oil-scented air. "Caleb Sterling," Arthur said, his voice rough but carrying an undeniable weight of history. Caleb nodded once. "Mr. Montgomery." The old racer looked past Caleb and focused on the hand-built engine block. He walked into the garage and ignored the grease on the floor. Victoria Vance found her voice and stepped onto the concrete of Caleb's property. "Mr. Montgomery," she started, her voice high-pitched and frantic. "I am Victoria Vance, and I represent the development interests here." Arthur did not turn around. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the stylized crest of the crossed hammers. He ran his fingers over the lightning bolt and the hand-stamped serial numbers. "Silas Thorne told me he buried this before he disappeared," Arthur whispered. He leaned closer to the metal, and his shoulders shook slightly. "He said he couldn't let the corporate vultures have the aerodynamic data." Arthur turned back to Caleb, and his eyes were wet. "Everyone said he was crazy, and everyone said the car was burned." Victoria stepped closer, her heels clicking nervously. "It is still a neighborhood safety issue, Mr. Montgomery," she insisted. "This man dragged a $100 pile of trash into a luxury zone." Arthur Montgomery straightened his back and looked at Victoria for the first time. The silence that followed was heavy and cold. "You see trash, Victoria," Arthur said. "But I see the only reason I am still alive today." He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a leather checkbook. He looked at Caleb, and the two men shared a look of mutual understanding that did not require a single word. Arthur wrote a number on the paper with a steady hand. He tore the check from the book and held it out toward the rusted metal. Victoria craned her neck to see the ink. Her face went completely bloodless when she saw the 5 followed by 6 zeros. Lily looked up at her father and noticed the way the light from the open garage door made the check glow. Caleb did not reach for the money yet. He looked at the woolen scarf in Lily's hand and then at the machine he had protected for 48 hours. The neighborhood held its breath as the truth finally emerged from the rust. Caleb Sterling was no longer just a single dad in a weathered house. He was the guardian of a king's ransom. Arthur Montgomery waited for the answer while Victoria Vance realized that her $30 million empire had just been silenced by a $100 ghost. Caleb stepped toward the check. He felt the heart of the machine roar in his mind. The countdown was over. Arthur Montgomery held the check steady between 2 fingers while the paper fluttered slightly in the cooling breeze of the rotor wash. Caleb Sterling looked at the ink on the surface, but his hand remained at his side. He did not look at the $5 million figure with the hunger of a man who had finally found an escape. He looked at it with the heavy assessment of someone weighing the cost of a soul. Victoria Vance took a sharp step forward, her face a mask of pale shock and desperation. $5 million, she whispered, her voice cracking in the quiet driveway. Mr. Montgomery, you cannot be serious. This man is a freelance mechanic in a residential zone. This is a salvage yard reject. Arthur Montgomery did not turn to look at her. He kept his eyes on Caleb's grease-stained face. The world is full of people who build towers, Victoria, but it is empty of people who know how to keep them from falling, Arthur said. He moved closer to the rusted chassis and ran his hand along the raw iron of the pillar. Silas Thorne died to protect the blueprints in this engine block. He knew that the moment corporate interests touched his work, they would strip the art away to save a few pennies on production. Caleb finally took a step toward the old racer. The internal crankshaft seal is intact, Caleb said. His voice was a calm anchor amidst Victoria's mounting panic. I checked the tolerances this morning. The timing sequence hasn't shifted by a single millimeter in 50 years. Arthur gave a short, dry laugh that sounded like gravel grinding together. Of course it hasn't. Silas Thorne didn't build things to fail, Caleb. Victoria watched the exchange and realized the narrative was slipping from her fingers. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out her phone. Caleb, I will match any reasonable offer to keep this lot quiet, she said, her words coming out fast. We can settle this right now without the city inspectors. Caleb turned to her for the first time. He noticed how her expensive phone trembled in her hand. It was never about the neighborhood association, Victoria, Caleb said. He looked at Lily, who was still clutching her mother's old scarf. You told my daughter she was growing up in a junkyard. You looked at a masterpiece and saw a nuisance. Caleb turned back to Arthur and reached out to take the check. He didn't tuck it into his pocket, but held it up so the light caught the watermark. I have one condition, Mr. Montgomery, Caleb said. The neighborhood was so silent that the distant sound of a barking dog seemed to echo off the condos. Arthur nodded. Name it. The car goes to the National Racing Museum, Caleb said firmly. And the information placard must state that the storm chaser was saved by someone who knew its heart before they knew its price. Arthur smiled, a genuine and tired smile. I wouldn't have it any other way, Caleb. Caleb handed the check back to Arthur. Victoria let out a sharp breath of confusion. Why are you giving it back? She stammered. Caleb looked at his small house and then at the sky. Because I don't need $5 million to be a father, Victoria, Caleb said. But the museum needs the money to make sure this story never gets buried again. Caleb Sterling walked back toward his garage and left the elite of the city standing in his gravel driveway. He picked up his wire brush and went back to work on a small detail on the axle. The legend was real and the treasure was safe, but Caleb Sterling was just getting started. Victoria Vance stood alone near her SUV as the helicopter rotors began to turn once more. She felt the weight of her mistakes sitting in her chest like lead. Caleb Sterling was no longer a man she could bulldoze. He was the man who had just taught her that the most valuable thing in the neighborhood was the only thing she couldn't buy. Caleb heard Lily's small laughter as she began to help him polish the copper fittings. The ghost was home. Victoria Vance watched the helicopter disappear into the gray horizon while the silence in Caleb Sterling's driveway became heavy enough to choke her. She stood by her SUV and looked at the oil stains on the gravel where Arthur Montgomery had just knelt. Her phone buzzed in her pocket with a notification about the morning stock opening, but she did not pull it out. Caleb was already back inside the garage, and the rhythmic sound of his wire brush against metal resumed, as if the millionaires had never arrived. He did not celebrate. He did not dance. Caleb simply worked. Victoria stepped onto the concrete lip of the garage and felt the sudden drop in temperature. "Caleb," she said, her voice losing the sharp edge of command for the first time. Caleb did not stop his rhythmic scrubbing. He focused on a small copper line near the carburetor housing. "The city inspectors will be back in less than 48 hours, Victoria," Caleb said without looking up. He moved the brush with a precision that made the metal shine like a dull mirror. "You should probably call them and tell them the nuisance is actually a national monument." Victoria leaned against the doorframe and looked at Lily, who was sitting on her bucket. The little girl was meticulously folding her mother's woolen scarf and placing it into a small wooden box. Lily looked at Victoria with a gaze that was neither angry nor afraid. It was the look of a child who had seen a giant fall and was now wondering if the giant would try to get back up. Victoria cleared her throat. "I had a team of architects look at this block 3 months ago," she admitted. Her words were slow and came with a visible effort. "They told me that people who work with their hands don't belong in a modern landscape. They said a garage is just a hole in a profit margin." Caleb finally set the brush down and wiped his palms on his stained jeans. He turned to Victoria, and the light from the single bulb caught the deep lines around his eyes. "Your architects look at blueprints, Victoria," Caleb said. He walked over to the chassis and tapped the heavy steel of the B-pillar. "Blueprints tell you where the walls go, but they don't tell you what makes the house stay standing. You saw a rusted car, but you didn't see the man who designed it or the men who drove it." Victoria looked at the crossed hammer's crest and felt a strange, hollow sensation in her chest. She realized she had spent years building towers that had no stories. She had built boxes for people to live in without ever considering the people themselves. "Montgomery offered you enough money to buy every house on this street, Caleb," Victoria said. She looked at the peeling paint on his walls and the old tools on the pegboard. "Why would you give it away to a museum?" Caleb reached out and gently ruffled Lily's hair as she walked past him to the sink. "Because I am building a daughter, Victoria," Caleb replied. "And I want her to know that a name is worth more than a check. If I took that $5 million, she would only remember the money. Now she will remember the car and the man who fixed it." Victoria looked at the small girl and then at the father who stood like an iron post in the center of his world. She realized that Caleb Sterling had more security in his drafty garage than she had in her 40-story glass tower. Victoria turned to leave, but stopped at the edge of the driveway. She looked at the lot next door where the foundation for her condos was being poured. For the first time, the concrete looked cold and empty. Caleb picked up a wrench, and the sound of steel meeting steel echoed through the neighborhood. The ghost of Silas Thorne was safe, but the lessons of the storm chaser were just beginning to sink in. Victoria walked to her car and knew that she was the one who was truly homeless. Caleb heard the heavy door of the SUV close, and then the sound of tires on gravel. He looked at the chassis one last time before clicking off the light. The ghost was home, and the father was ready. The neighborhood went dark, but the heart of the machine kept beating. Caleb pulled the garage door shut, and the lock clicked with a finality that shook the street. Everything was about to change. Caleb Sterling spent the following Friday morning sitting on the front porch with a mug of black coffee, while the neighborhood returned to its usual suburban rhythm. The black SUV was gone, and the helicopter had long since cleared the horizon, leaving only the faint scent of aviation fuel in the stagnant air. He watched Lily play in the small patch of grass near the garage, where she was using a stick to draw a long, low shape in the dirt. She looked up at him and smiled while holding the wooden box that contained her mother's scarf. Caleb noticed that she wasn't looking at the condos next door anymore. He felt a sense of stillness that had been missing for years. At precisely 10 o'clock, a silver sedan pulled to the curb and Victoria Vance stepped out onto the sidewalk. She did not wear the black blazer or the gold watch today. She was dressed in a simple navy blue sweater and jeans, looking less like a titan of industry and more like a person who had spent a long night thinking. She walked up the driveway with slow, deliberate steps and stopped at the bottom of the porch. Caleb did not stand up, but he gestured toward the empty chair beside him. Victoria sat down and looked at the closed garage door. The city inspectors received a formal withdrawal of the complaint this morning. Victoria said, her voice matching the quiet of the street. Caleb took a sip of his coffee and watched a sparrow land on the fence. "I appreciate that, Victoria," he replied. He did not offer forgiveness or bitterness. Victoria leaned back and looked at Lily. "Arthur Montgomery called me late last night after he spoke with the museum board," she continued. Caleb saw the way she gripped the armrest of the chair. "He told me that Silas Thorne didn't just build cars. He built legacies for people who had nothing else left." Victoria turned to Caleb, and the sunlight caught the redness in her eyes. "I realize that I have spent my entire career clearing away the past to make room for a future that has no soul, Caleb." Caleb set his mug down and leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "The future always has a soul, Victoria," Caleb said. He looked at the rough skin on his palms. "It just depends on whether the people building it are willing to get their hands dirty." Victoria looked at the condos and then back at the garage. "I want to fund the preservation wing at the museum, Caleb," she said. Caleb shook his head slowly. "Don't do it for me, Victoria, and don't do it to balance your books." Victoria looked at him with a puzzled expression. "Then why should I do it?" she asked. Caleb pointed toward Lily. "Do it so that 50 years from now another little girl doesn't have to hear that her father's work is a nuisance." Victoria remained silent for a full minute while the wind stirred the dry leaves in the driveway. She stood up and extended her hand toward Caleb. Caleb reached out and shook it, and for the first time there was no power play between them. Victoria walked back to her car and drove away without looking back. Caleb walked down the steps and knelt beside Lily in the grass. He picked up the stick and added a small pair of crossed hammers to the drawing she had made. Lily laughed and leaned her head against his shoulder while the afternoon sun turned the dust into gold. Caleb Sterling knew the storm chaser was finally where it belonged, but he also knew that the Real treasure was already safe at home. The neighborhood was quiet, and the father was content. Caleb stood up and dapped Lily back toward the house. The ghost had found its rest. Everything was exactly as it should be.